Is this on? Yeah, thank you. So everyone has promised everything from the framework, so it is really the silver bullet. So I'm lucky to take this on. But before I begin, I'd like to thank UNEP. I used to work with UNEP before for 6 years before I left last year, but it's good that Salman, you call me a colleague still, so I'm very much still part of the team, it feels like. Also Carl, my co-author, he's not here, but he's also been part of the developing both the presentation and also the exercise. So we're both sort of very much in tandem in terms of what we have done together here. So the framework really is the minutiae of the project. I mean, if you think of all the things that have been talked about before, you know, ranging from the SDGs to food security, to theory of change. So it really focuses on a very small portion of all those things. So I'm hoping that it's not so much a static exercise in which I just present to you the sort of framework that we've come up with, but maybe give you a sense of what we went through as we developed it and how we can all play with it later on in the afternoon session. Okay, so I've divided the presentation into 3 parts. I'll briefly talk about the background of the presentation, or background of the framework and the sort of thinking that went behind developing it. The second part of my presentation would be on the actual framework, where we can talk about the components and get into a bit of a detail about it, and also highlight some of the relationships of the framework to other initiatives and frameworks. You know, we've heard about SIA earlier, and also the integrated wealth accounting and so on. And lastly, I'll just give an introduction to the exercise that we're going to have in the afternoon. Okay, so the conversation around the framework started in 2015 and 16, mostly by Pavan and Alexander, who are here. And it very much stems out from the mandate of the TEEB Agriculture and Food Project, which is to inform policymaking in a comprehensive and holistic way, to highlight all the invisible and visible costs and benefits of our food systems. So to be able to do that, we have to come up with a comprehensive information base of what all we should consider when we try to do a comprehensive evaluation, right? So it basically provides you this sort of base. What is the value of doing this? Well, firstly, I think research happens in silos, so having a comprehensive information base can actually push researchers and push the research agenda to be able to take on new valuation methodologies, to be able to see things in a different way. It can also bring transparency to assessments. So if you have, you know, this framework and you see somebody has done an assessment of yields per hectare, you can contextualize it and say, look, you're only looking at one component of that information base that you would need to be able to make that sort of comprehensive or holistic decision making. And I think most importantly, and I hope, you know, when we do this exercise in the afternoon, we can get a sense that it establishes a common language. So people, you know, it was mentioned, the Italian food system was mentioned earlier. Jackie, you mentioned trees and food security. Someone from SACGOT also mentioned something. So all these different perspectives and entry points to our single food system. So we have to have a framework that allows you to come from all these different angles and be able to talk about it in the same way. And of course, related to that, some of the guiding principles of the framework are that it has to include the entire value chain. We cannot be comprehensive if we look at farm gate effects of our food systems only. We have to understand them through to consumption. And of course, another demand of being comprehensive is to have all capitals represented. So for instance, a lot of environmentalists usually concern themselves with natural capital, social scientists with social capital, health with human capital, and economists with produced capital. So we have to consider all these different capitals to be able to make that comprehensive decision making. And of course, the distinction that I'll make here is between stocks and flows, and it's an important distinction. So while we have capital stocks, like human capital, natural capital, there are also flows that comes from these stocks. So environmental flows, health flows, and so on. And this is an important distinction to make for the question of sustainability, which I think you asked earlier. Yeah. So I'm going to sort of try to demonstrate how we can organize this by using this diagram, which is very homemade. As you can tell, it's basically a very simple value chain of oil palm, or palm oil, sorry. And you can see on the side of A, there is production, there is a whole value chain where it goes through processing and distribution, and then it's consumed by someone who really likes oil palm cookies and gets a bit big. So So let's look at this, and this looks very simple, right? So there's a lot of things happening. So there's a whole value chain. It's happening in different countries, so there's a whole spatial dimension to this value chain. It's happening over time, so there's a temporal dimension to this value chain. There are several parts, several categorically different things that are there. So you've got factories, which is a stock, infrastructure, which is a stock, but you also have environmental flows, which is water. You have pollution, which is a flow. So you've got different stocks and flows happening here. Things are going in and out of the system. So over there, you've got, I'm sorry, the light on this is not great, but you've got fertilizer and water and labor inputs that are going into creating oil palm. But then also as an output, you're getting not only the palm oil fruit, but you're also getting maybe some pollution, some loss of biodiversity, and so on. So there are lots of different kinds of things happening. And they're of very different nature. So some of these things are economic in nature. Some of them are related to human health. For instance, the peat burning to create farmland can impact health of Singaporeans in terms of respiratory diseases. This is something that came up a few years ago and sort of tends to do that every few years. So there is health impacts, there is economic impacts, and there's also security and livelihood impacts of palm oil. So these are very different things. So how do we organize these complex different things into a simple way? And which is the framework here. So I'd like you to think that the framework doesn't complicate, but rather simplifies things. Because when you see this, you say, oh my God, there's so much to be done. There's so many components to the system. But it actually brings together similar things like flows, stocks, and outcomes into one umbrella. So you can actually see what your assessment, where your point of view, where your perspective fits into this entire system. And I think there's a copy of this in the handout, so if you cannot see the text here, it might be useful to refer to that. Sorry? Yeah. So if we go back to this value chain, right? So now we can, shall I give you a minute to just look over the framework? Yeah. So as you can see on the x-axis, we have all the 4 stocks that I talked about, so produced, natural, human, and social. We also have all the different kinds of flows. So when we started to tease apart these systems and look at all the work that have been done by other frameworks, we could actually say, oh, one of the flows that comes out of food systems is agriculture and food outputs. This stuff is usually captured in the system of national accounts. So these are the visible flows, right? Then you've got invisible flows, like ecosystem services that flow from natural capital into the value chain, and which actually leads to outcomes. So one of the things that you might do is when you clear cut or when you deforest to plant something, or oil palm, just because it's an easy target, you actually lead to a lot of carbon emissions. So that has a negative outcome in terms of natural capital, because now you've got higher concentrations of carbon, which of course has an impact on your economy, which is the last top layer of this framework. So you can see how flows interacting with the value chain that come from different capitals lead to different kind of outcomes, which can have different kind of impacts. So this is the narrative of the framework and the structure of the framework. So if we just go back to the palm oil example, now we can actually categorically talk about these things across systems. So we have the natural capital stock, which is the forest. We have deforestation and biodiversity loss, which is an outcome. And of course, this leads to loss in ecosystem services, which is an impact. So that would impact your food security. That would impact pollination services, for example, or provisioning of wild game, which is a provisioning service. And of course, you can also look at the person who's eating all the cookies as a human capital stock. And, and these negative health outcomes are the outcomes, and how do they manifest in the economy? Loss in productivity or health costs associated with obesity. So you can see how you can connect capitals to flows to outcomes and impacts, yeah? And even if this stuff is not really making sense right now, and it's a lot, I think the exercise, when you get to play with it, you'll be able to situate your own system in the framework, and you'll see how it comes alive. So yes, so this is, so I will reiterate my point that the framework actually simplifies rather than complicates things. it allows you to describe a system. I think a lot of the things that came up earlier, everything actually that Barbara, you presented was a description of the agriculture and food system. So this framework is not just limited to having a checklist and say, oh yes, I'm calculating the impact of health outcomes, but I'm actually describing the system. I'm talking about the social capital, the institutional context of where agriculture happens, and which is a huge context in all agricultural. I mean, agriculture is not a market-driven sector. Every country subsidizes agriculture and creates public policies around it. So that sort of social capital context is absolute key to be able to understand the system that we're trying to change. And I think the framework allows you to describe a system rather than just being able to analyze it. And briefly, just to say where the other frameworks fit in. So if you look at TEEB, does this work? Yeah. So TEEB actually looks at natural capital, it looks at ecosystem services and these outcomes. The integrated wealth framework actually looks at all these capital bases and looks at adjusted capital account or GDP measures at the national level. The SIA, which Salman presented earlier, talks a lot about natural capital, ecosystem services, and over here the outcomes. So you can see how these frameworks sort of fit in. And this comprehensive view can actually allow for different frameworks to enter and exit the system. In terms of what has happened so far, of course, the fact that all of you are here is a great indicator of progress. There are people behind this. Those 2 Nature publications were mentioned earlier. There was also a prize from the World Future Council that we received. And most importantly, these 2 reports, or I guess the Foundation's report, which is a brainchild of so many different people some of them are here, some of them are not, coming from different angles and perspectives. So clearly there's a demand for this sort of thinking. Not just demand, people are actually signing up for it. And there have been a lot of case studies and also, of course, national projects that are now funded by donors who think that this is something that could be done and actually inform our conversations around agriculture and food systems. So in that sense, there is momentum. The framework looks big. It looks, wow, there's so many things going on, but actually it can allow us to simplify systems and understand them in the broader context and not be able to start analysis without description, which is key. So I can either take questions now, I don't know how much time I have, or I can introduce the exercise and then...
Maybe questions first.
Okay, questions first. Okay. Please.
Hi. Do I need to introduce again? I'm Kamal from Charles Darwin University, Australia. I'm just looking at the framework carefully now, because earlier I didn't bother to read the subheadings within that. Looking at that, the arrow from capitals up, ecosystem services are separate than agriculture and food outputs. To me, I think, working as an ecological economist, agricultural systems are part of, and what they produce are part of ecosystem services. So why we got them separate here? Yeah. I know that there are other things, taxes and subsidies and other things, but at least the food output, that should be an ecosystem service. There must be something that's why it's categorized separately.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the reasons why this framework is I think one of the strengths of this framework is that we had Karl Obst coming from an accounting perspective. So the reason why a lot of these choices have been made is that they're consistent with national accounting. So a lot of these agriculture and food outputs that we have here are usually captured by the market. And of course, there are methods like resource rent if you wanted to extract the contribution of the system, rather than using the provisioning value of the service. And the whole SIA, I think, discussion, where even Salman can add to that, has been a discussion around basically the challenges between integrating an environmental accounting approach with an ecosystem accounting approach, ecological economics approach. And I think one of the reasons why they're separate is because of the invisible and visible nature. Yeah.
I think you think it's the most prominent ecosystem service within the agricultural systems. And that's the sense I've been getting in this room since yesterday, that whether we presume that the natural systems are different than the agricultural systems, because yesterday when Salman was talking, he did mention that ecosystem services flow from nature to agricultural systems. But as coming from agricultural background and working in the field of ecology for the last 20, 30 years, I believe that the agricultural systems are part of nature, and we are all part of nature. We can't separate the two systems. Yeah. The flows are both ways.
And that's very much the view, I think, of the framework, because human capital and social capital are integral to the system as well. So I think so, but I think when you start playing with the exercise, when you start accounting for them, you will see why they're kept separate. There's a whole description of why that's the case in the chapter itself. But if you read it, if you start to play with it, you'll see why. This is to avoid double counting and commensurability. Yeah, yeah.
So I think, can I try and provide some clarity? I suspect I may know what the question is about. So I think the challenge here is making sure that we establish, to begin with, the purpose of the valuation. The entire framework is nothing but a guidance mechanism for valuation. And what it's saying is, this is what you should measure and value and why. But it's giving you the full picture. It is saying, here's the entire value chain, and here are all of the externalities. And of course, there are some which are not externalities, like value addition components which are there in GDP. And there are some elements of value addition which are intermediate flows, which would not be captured in GDP. Ecosystem services are among the intermediate flows. They are very important, because without pollination, nutrient cycling, water cycling, etc., which are all ecosystem functions, you wouldn't get agriculture. Right? So they're there, but they're all recognized as intermediate flows. And if the purpose of your valuation is to ensure that there is adequate representation of these intermediate flows in policy making, then you will pick them up. If your purpose is something else, which is to compare two products, both of which rely on the same ecosystem inputs, but actually process and grow and use different fertilizer and chemical pesticides, or not use them, as the case may be, then you may ignore them, because up to that point in the value chain, everything is the same. So it doesn't matter. When you're doing a valuation, it's always comparing one scenario versus the other. If everything up to the point of the gate of your boundary is the same, it doesn't matter what that previous scenario was. So it really, the whole thing will typically hang on using the framework as a toolkit, which tells you what to value and why, and then figuring out what are the elements of the toolkit of that table of, on the one hand, the value chain, and on the other, all of the impacts, be they accounted for in GDP or not accounted for in GDP, externalities or not. You have to decide which boxes to tick. And there cannot be a study which is so complicated that it ticks every box. I mean, that would be impossible, right? So you'll have to decide based on your valuation question, your research question, your valuation question, which ones am I actually looking at? Okay, so that's the way to
yeah, and just to add to that, I think agriculture and food outputs, so you can get an output without being able to understand the sustainability of the system. So measuring ecosystem services is actually a separate descriptive exercise than just measuring outputs. Because you can continue to produce and use the same land without understanding, okay, the water is coming from there, and that system may not be able to deliver that water in the long term. So that's a different kind of question, a descriptive question, than agriculture and food outputs, which is more of a sustainability measure than the outputs themselves.
Microphone, please. Microphone for the speaker.
Thank you very much for this evaluation framework. But I just have a concern. One of the things that I noticed is that issues of the broader political economy is, in my view, not well addressed here. And if you've listened to the previous speakers, we've talked about how the global trading system and, issues related to that affect a lot of the, the agri-food system. And I'm wondering, you probably are thinking that these issues are well captured under the social capital. But from my perspective, even the word capital itself is, you're already referring to sort of the positive aspect. But I'm more interested in, the conflicts that are brought about by how the international global trading system operates and works. And in my view, there's not much capital in that system. And so how would we, capture some of these conflict and broader political economy issues in this framework, because they affect a lot, what it is you're able to do and how you can make the system more sustainable.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I would say that I think those sort of questions are great entry points into the framework. To be able to understand how international trade laws and regulations actually change the way food is produced and consumed. And it can actually highlight those things better. So I would think that that's a great entry point for applying the framework.
Are there more questions here? Yeah, please go ahead.
Hi, just a comment. This is Marina Bortoletti from UN Environment. So thanks a lot for the presentation. I'm a big fan of the TEEB work. I just want to comment that we have developed also a framework for food systems, but it's not necessarily an evaluation framework, but it's more like a policy framework on how policymakers can integrate holistic approach as well into the policy-making process. So an evaluation assessment, an assessment of the food systems is one element, but there are also other elements related to institutional setups, to actors' engagement, etc. So we are looking into how we can integrate TEEB into our work, and it would be nice if we can discuss this more later.
Sure. Oh.
So,
Please.
I mean, interesting to hear that. So, as Kavita mentioned, the framework is inclusive. It allows different points of entry and different ways of looking at valuation. Valuation is a human institution. It doesn't have to be economic. It can be any form. The point you specifically raised there, I think, goes to the heart of the components of social capital, because social capital in terms of relation is basically an economic metaphor representing the value of relationships in society. And you're talking about social institutions, both formal as well as informal institutions. If you were to use that entry point in terms of we want to look at how social capital, in other words, institutional and non-institutional works in the context of agriculture, then make that your entry point. And then define your valuation or your evaluation as being comparing a system which does have social capital in the forms that you described to one that doesn't, and what would be the outcomes and the impacts of either system, compare one with the other. So this is, I'm just picking up from where you left in terms of asking for an institutional context and evaluation and showing how the framework would be used in that context. It would not lead to an economic metric. It wouldn't say this approach has value X and that approach has value Y, but it would give you a qualitative description comparing the advantages and the disadvantages of one versus the other.
Thanks a lot, Pavan. We have to move on in order to start our practical exercise. And Kavita, you wanted to introduce the practical exercise. And then I would like to ask Dustin to join us in order to provide some housekeeping informations where the exercise is taking place. First, Kavita, please.
Okay. So I think the exercise packages are all in the information package for the workshop itself. And I guess when Carl and I were talking about this, we wanted to do several things. One, we wanted you to get a sense of incorporating all capitals and looking at not just agriculture and food systems from the environmental point of view, but also the social and human points of view. Also, we wanted to encourage a systemic thinking in which all these different components are part of the same system that influence it in different ways. And also using a common language to describe several different systems. So I think we're about 90 people, 80, 90 people, so maybe 9 groups of 7 to 8 people. And 2 groups will deal with one commodity, 2 another. So one of them is tomato, wheat, and chicken are the 3 commodities. So you can decide what group you want to be part of. And you can already start to see that there are different lengths of value chains and supply chains that are in these 3 commodities, which I think will also help you play with the system. And of course, where it's located is going to determine several things. You know, we talked about a tomato field in Italy, where there are a lot of migrant workers, for instance. That will raise other kinds of issues than tomato fields elsewhere. And And then, of course, we would, so we have these spreadsheets or these Excel tables that you can use to guide your discussions. But we're hoping that you'll all have flip charts and post-it notes where you can construct your own value chain for these commodities. Try to identify, depending on the system that you're looking at, what the issues might be, what those, you know, what the outputs might be, what might be the ecosystem services that are going into the system, what might be the spatial scale of the system that you're considering. So we're hoping that both of these allow you to come up with maybe something more interesting than the palm oil example, maybe a more extensive value chain where you identify these flows and outcomes and impacts. So I think maybe then I'll pass it on to Dustin. Maybe you can introduce where or